saints are ordinary people. They're ordinary people who, over the course of their life, come into sort of an extraordinary openness to God's presence in their life, and an extraordinary receptivity and generous response to that presence. Well, Saint Raphaela is the foundress of the Handmaids of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, our congregation. She was born in a little village in the south of Spain outside of Cordoba called Pedro Abad, and it was in 1850. And her dad was actually the mayor of their town, and she was the 10th of 13 kids. I think 3 of her siblings passed away very young, but she had a large family. And her parents were very given to sort of, I think her dad lived this role of mayor as a role of service in the town. He actually died tending to sick people during an outbreak of like an epidemic. He was tending to people who were ill in the town, contracted the illness and died. So she had this real model of, like, I think, servant leadership growing up. And she and her sister took that on. So as little kids and then as like young women, they sort of sought out these opportunities to also serve. Sometimes like after their father died, and then after her mom died when she was 18, they would do this sort of hidden from their brothers, their older brothers who were left in charge of the household, because the brothers didn't really love that they were sneaking out in, the wee hours of the night to tend to people who were sick or widowed, but that's what they would do. They would kind of bring the resources that they could to do this service, and they had this sense. They were from a well-to-do family, but they had this sense that, like, we've been served long enough. Was one of the lines that I think it was Pilar, her sister, named, was, we've been served for a long time, and we're called to go outside of ourselves to give. So that foundation, I think, was laid early on in their life from the witness of their parents and then their early experience. And they both felt called to religious life. They ended up entering with the Poor Clares, not officially entering, but going and staying with them to discern their vocation, spent some time there, and then entered formally with the Reparatrix Sisters, which was a French order. And through a series of events, those sisters left their area and just left, closed that convent. And Dolores and Raphaela felt called to stay. And as they were sort of discerning this and naming this, a bunch of the other sisters said, well, we do too. And so stayed with them. And that was the first group of handmaids. They were never really planning to found a congregation, but over kind of the series of events, they realized, oh, this is something new. There's something happening here that Raphaela was kind of the natural choice. She was a very gentle sort of leader, but a very marked leader. She, I would say, probably had the leadership style of walking beside those that she was called to lead. And so she was the first superior general once the Institute was approved by the Vatican and kind of had official recognition. She was the formator of the novices and then was the first leader of the congregation. Something that's very embedded in our DNA as a congregation is reparation, is healing, is rebuilding bridges that have been broken down. And I think that comes from this very particular experience that we had in the early days of the Institute between Raphaela and Dolores, these two blood sisters who became the co-foundresses of the congregation, and their early team of kind of advisors. Raphaela had this very, very profound sense that the Institute, that the congregation, was born out of Christ's heart. She said, this was a series of mishaps and confusion that never would have resulted in anything if God hadn't just shepherded this thing forward and desired it into being. And so she believed very, very deeply that, like, the Institute is born out of the heart of Christ, out of this desire of Christ, that this congregation do something good in the world and the church, right? And so her understanding that the Institute had come into being through the undoing of their own plans. They had all these plans, they had all these thoughts of, like, all right, this is how we're going to follow God's will. And it was in the undoing of a lot of plans that this was born. And they understood that as like, yeah, we have lots of ideas, but sometimes God leads us down a path that we never would have suspected, so right? The name Handmaids of the Sacred Heart of Jesus came forth from that understanding that this has its root and its sustenance and its source in the heart of Christ.